I've got something to show you, sir. Won't take long. Oh, those shoes feel better. Boy.
It's a murder mystery, but the twist is that the audience has already seen how it was done and by whom. The other twist, the detective looks like a lettuce, well past its prime, sold at a gas station along a part of the highway that no one visits very much.
Are you actually trying to pin this murder on me with that?
Yes.
If you are a rich sociopath looking to bump off someone, pro tip, do it on this guy's day off. Columbo.
That's my specialty, you know. Homicide.
Columbo was originally a character in a one-off story that eventually spawned a series of mystery movies first broadcast throughout the 1970s. It starred Peter Falk as Lt Columbo, a detective who redefined the term disheveled, which is a fancy way of saying gas station lettuce. Have you ever seen someone who looks like they just jumped off a train in a rainstorm, had their clothes ripped by barbed wire, and had been caught in a mini tornado? Maybe not, but if you had, it could be Columbo, or at the very least, somebody cosplaying as Columbo, or just maybe someone who really didn't want to get wet.
Uh-oh. Not a bad one, huh, Doc?
Yes, that's a bad one.
Columbo was a series without car chases or fistfights, where episodes would become a battle of wits between a suspected killer and an unassuming police detective. He's a cop whose methods for wearing down the killer involve fantastic powers of deduction, persistence, and being an incredibly annoying prick. A bit like catching a packed bus to work in the morning and the person standing next to you has a long and loud phone conversation where they rank the top 50 most underrated episodes of The Walking Dead.
The only thing I can do is just check out every name on that list.
This video will look at the creation of the series, the run of episodes made in the 70s, and its second wind made more than a decade later, where in total there were 69 episodes of Columbo, running between 70 and 100 minutes. There was also a much unloved Columbo spin-off starring Kate Mulgrew as Mrs. Columbo that Peter Falk would have absolutely nothing to do with.
There's very little that I wouldn't do in order to solve the case.
Years after the series ended, Columbo would be embraced by an entirely new generation of fans. Fans whose parents weren't even born when Peter Falk first donned that ratty raincoat on a sunny day.
Well, what do you know about that?
Columbo is a mystery show where a detective investigates murders slowly and methodically, and often it appears though he's wasting time or he's become distracted.
What'd you pay for those shoes?
It's also a series where the star was, for a very long time, often brazenly at war with the studio making the series.
Say you don't give in to him. He walks. Then what are you going to do?
Los Angeles police detective Lt Columbo works Homicide, so when he rocks up, you know it's not good news. But he's so jolly that he's definitely the person you want telling you that a family member was horribly murdered. And also, in all likelihood, he's probably the one who's going to arrest you for the crime.
I can't prove that you killed Mrs. Donner, but I can prove that you killed Mr. Donner.
Columbo does not work downtown or deal with street crimes. He works almost exclusively within the rarefied atmosphere of the rich, the famous, and the completely screwed up. There are occasional accidental deaths that are covered up or crimes of passion, something committed in the heat of the moment, but the vast majority of killings are premeditated and planned to the nth degree by somebody who is supremely confident of their intelligence and their ability to get away with murder. Often these people will take one look at Columbo and misjudge him, simply because he looks like a half-made calzone that realistically is just a pizza. Any killer that underestimates Columbo does so at their own peril.
Have you taken leave of your senses?
Well, I guess it looks that way, doesn't it?
Columbo is definitely a cop, but the series is not a traditional cop show, but a mystery that owes more to Agatha Christie than Dragnet. You know who also owed a lot to Agatha Christie after a bad run at poker? Uncle Reg's grandpappy, Miles. I mean, Killer Christie will send around the boys if you're even an hour late with the payment.
Oh, that's gonna land, sir. Is it? Yeah, that's landing.
Whereas a whodunit often saves the revelation of the killer's identity and how they did it for the very end of the mystery, Columbo is an inverted mystery, which shows you the killer preparing for a killing, the actual murder, and many of the steps they take to avoid suspicion. The viewer will usually know the killer's identity before Columbo has even finished putting on his raincoat.
Why don't you just describe it to me?
The show Columbo has been dubbed a howcatchem, where the idea is to see a master detective amass the evidence needed for an arrest. Columbo will start nosing around a crime scene, and often it will be one tiny little thing that piques his interest. It's not necessarily a clue that will incriminate anyone, but it's just enough to get the ball rolling.
Hey.
Uh-huh.
Wait a minute.
Dawning on you now?
Yeah.
Knew you'd get it.
Even if Columbo does have an idea who the killer is, he still needs to prove it and to build a case. His preferred methodology: annoy the hell out of the most likely suspect.
Exactly what is your point, Lieutenant?
I'm not sure I have one.
Columbo shows up wherever the killer is, whether it's at home, at their place of work, or in a restaurant, or wherever, time and time again. Despite Columbo hanging around like a bad smell in a fart showroom, the killer often has no choice but to grit their teeth and hope that Columbo loses interest in the case before he can put together all of the clues. Columbo's investigations are like the aftertaste of Coke Zero Sugar with Oreo. They both seem to last forever. Columbo doesn't just turn up like a bad penny, he turns up like all of the bad pennies.
Because she thinks you're responsible for the death of her husband. You want to know something? So do I.
Columbo rarely loses his temper with a suspect, and by and large would play things as a scatterbrained but respectful and affable investigator. Columbo, of course, doesn't suspect the main suspect. He's just filling in the details for his report. It's routine. His boss insists on such things, that sort of thing. Columbo might come across as a granddad trying to use a QR code for the first time,
That'll be a son of a gun.
but no, he's actually in fact really sharp. When he doesn't have the evidence, he'll just keep digging. Columbo's so successful at getting under a suspect's skin that he could always moonlight as a tattoo artist.
Oh, one more thing before I forget.
Part of his shtick would see Columbo taking his leave of a suspect before remembering he had another question. Just one more thing was Columbo's trademark catchphrase.
Oh, listen, there's one other thing I wanted to ask you about. Oh, one more thing.
Oh, one more thing, sir.
Added into one script as almost a throwaway, but quickly became something that was latched onto by first writers and then fans.
Oh, listen, just one more thing.
Columbo would often diffuse the rising agitation of a suspect by pushing the responsibility for his doggedness onto his need to tie up loose ends. Or perhaps it was down to his superior, who insisted that every I was dotted and every T was crossed on Columbo's eventual report. Not that we saw Columbo at the station all that often.
I don't think I've ever seen you there.
Well, I don't get down there too much. None of the murders take place there, you know.
When dealing with other police, Columbo's persona will often sharpen up considerably, where he's quite capable of giving orders and delegating tasks to a variety of sergeants. There are times where Columbo privately admits that he knows the killer's identity, but he still needs more evidence.
I kind of knew it right from the start. There was nothing definite. It was a lot of little things.
And at times, he will alert the suspect to the fact that he thinks they did it at a fairly early stage.
You killed Sharon Martin, and I believe you're trying to kill Dr. Heidemann.
And then at the end, Columbo will lay out some evidence where the killer will just have to accept that they've been rumbled. There are no car chases or fistfights, and not a lot of screaming. Basically the opposite of parents at a kid's soccer game. There are cases where the crimes are compounded by bystanders getting too close to the killer, and more killings result. And on a few occasions, the killer will take tentative steps towards killing Columbo when they feel he's getting just a bit too close. Columbo doesn't just put together a watertight case, but often he finds what's become known as the gotcha, a piece of evidence so incontrovertible that the killer realizes that they simply can't wriggle out of this.
Well, on the tape at the concert, you weren't wearing a flower. Now, on this film coming out of Mrs. Wells' apartment, you have a flower.
The gotcha could be something simple, a piece of evidence that proves guilt, or the killer walks into a sting operation set up by Columbo, or they're goaded into trying to tamper with the evidence. Most of the time, the gotchas are quite clever, though on a few occasions they do seem like they're plucked out of thin air, much like most of the entries on my resume. Some of Columbo's gotchas are quite elaborate, so elaborate they belong on Mission Impossible, where realistically the cost of such investigations would be something that no police department would ever wish to bear.
You found your murderer? In a manner of speaking, yes, sir, I have.
While the gotcha might convince the killer to go quietly, these are people who will be able to afford the very best defense lawyers, who don't actually have to disprove the evidence, only cast enough doubt on it and look for any technicalities that could get their client off. Also, he'd have to get his suit pressed, and Columbo would not necessarily make for a sterling witness once he starts pulling out random scraps of paper from his pockets. There's also the idea that some of Columbo's methods will borderline amount to entrapment.
This is entrapment.
Though of course that would only work if Columbo was the reason that they killed somebody.
And it's your perfect alibi that's gonna hang you.
In earlier years, Columbo's hectoring nature, bordering on harassment, would often irritate the killer to the point of antagonism. But this would soften over time as more and more suspects would form a cordial relationship with the man determined to arrest them. From later seasons, seem to have realised that they've been bested by the best, where even if the killer and Columbo despise each other, there will often be a mutual respect. Sometimes the episode will end with the killer leaving arm in arm with Columbo as they head off to be arrested. I mean, this could have been the start of a beautiful friendship, if it wasn't for the bloody murder business where Columbo's new bud had calmly and without remorse snuffed out the life of another human being.
Besides which, you wanted to kill my wife and you would have killed me.
The motives of the killer are often very important to the case, but would also go some way towards making the episode satisfying for viewers. On a few occasions, the reason for a killing is not sufficiently explained, which can detract from the enjoyment of some episodes. Just as a brilliant episode can still have a gotcha that isn't quite as thrilling as the rest of the package.
Tisn't.
Sometimes, though, a killing is accidental, and then it's the cover-up that Columbo hones in on. Often we'll have a crime of passion where we're treated to a future victim telling the future killer how they will expose some misdeed on the part of the killer, which would obviously ruin them. And then the killer will go off and without much thought, put into action a very elaborate scheme for A, murdering someone, B, giving themselves an alibi, and C, framing somebody else for the crime. Indeed, it's rather scary to see someone just decide out of the blue to kill someone, and yet they have a fully developed plan for murder, a patsy and an alibi all ready to go. I mean, these people do sound like they really would enjoy tabletop gaming. Some suspects will go to great lengths to suggest alternative events or provide their own spin on what happened to the victim, often in a way they think is brilliant, especially when Columbo plays along.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, that must explain that.
But this sort of behaviour does tend to spur Columbo on even further towards pinning the murder on them.
Why, that's very thoughtful of you, Doctor. I can't imagine how I forgot to ask that question.
The perps in these killings are often wealthy and powerful. Popular stars of stage and screen, a politician, a diplomat, chefs, critics, winemakers, photographers, writers, publishers, magicians, deputy police commissioners, doctors, lawyers, architects, a bullfighter, a used car dealer, and more.
Gotcha.
Most of the killers are cool, calm and collected, where they're able to ruthlessly carry out a murder for sometimes quite petty reasons, or sometimes it's out of revenge or a fear of exposure. But there's often a streak of arrogance and a feeling that their so-called intellectual superiority will overcome the shabby gas station lettuce. The killers are often meant to be incredibly unlikable. Yet often they're played by actors who exude an awful lot of charm that you can't help but like them. You can't help but hope that maybe they'll get away with it.
Lucky I didn't show up in my pajamas.
Columbo might look like a human tumbleweed that's let itself go, but he is in fact considered to be one of the best detectives on the police force, or at least in later years.
Causing that brain hemorrhage there.
Even though he's worked homicide for years, he's still quite squeamish at the sight of a dead body. He's not particularly good with boats,
False alarm.
speed, heights, aeroplanes, well, a lot of things actually.
Can you talk yet?
Not yet.
Columbo embarrasses easily when there's talk of sex, though he will get over that in later years.
I'm actually working on a case now.
Undercover.
He loves his raincoat, which, despite its condition, is something he can't do without. Los Angeles is not generally a rainy place, so it's perhaps more Columbo's version of a security blanket. Once, his wife bought him a new coat, but Columbo couldn't think straight with it, so he desperately tried to lose it by leaving it behind wherever possible.
Or somebody tries to lift it, you look the other way.
He just loves that old coat, even though the only time it's ever seen better days was when it was in the Sears catalogue. Columbo's greatest enemy is not the horde of killers from Beverly Hills, nor his superiors at the department. It's moths.
Turn out the light.
Lt Columbo never gives his first name, though when the props department at Universal made a fake ID for him, they gave his name as Frank, thinking no one would ever be able to make out that detail. He's married to his wife, who's known only as Mrs. Columbo. We will never ever meet her, and since she didn't need an ID, we also have no idea what her first name is.
Excuse me, Purser, have you seen my wife?
As a matter of fact, she's looking for you.
She's looking for me.
Mrs. Columbo is described as middle-aged and homely. She has her evening classes and is not generally the family cook. The Columbos are happily married but don't have kids of their own, but they have a huge extended family, also unseen, who act as an unofficial reference library for Columbo. It's been suggested that Columbo has, for some reason, invented his wife and all of the relatives, which is a ridiculous idea, but then I think I have an even stupider theory, where if you kept watching you'd see the epilogue where it's revealed that Columbo is actually the long-lost brother of every single killer. Now you can tell I've put as much thought into that as pretty much most fan theories.
He's got a good sense of humor.
Oh, he's good.
Well, I like to laugh.
In early years, Columbo would often eat a bowl of chili while he was out and about.
Bert, give me some chili.
There you go.
He was a chili connoisseur, chili and crackers, though at one point he seems to have lost his appetite for chili for a couple of years.
Say, that's delicious. I never tasted chili like that before.
That special recipe made out of squirrel meat.
Columbo loves his smelly dank cigars, and even when he occasionally tries to quit smoking, he's always got a half-chewed cigar on the go. As part of his beat, Columbo often comes into contact with celebrities, and he'll get a real kick out of meeting a TV chef his wife watches, who he then has to arrest, or an actress he's admired for years, who he then has to arrest, or an author whose book he loves, who he then has to arrest. There's a joy to his work. He loves his job despite the murder part. But if all of his idols didn't kill so many people, then he wouldn't get to meet them. It's a chicken and egg situation. It's totally a shame that Columbo's autograph book is also a list of the people he's arrested for murder.
And if it wasn't for my job, I wouldn't be getting to meet you like this.
Columbo at one point picks up a dog, an aging basset hound, who quite possibly longs for death's sweet embrace, though Columbo can never decide on a name other than just dog.
Didn't I tell you to stay in the car?
Columbo also drives a 1959 Peugeot 403 Cabriolet, which by the time the series began in 1971 was a little over a decade old, and even then it was old and beaten up, like Mr. Magoo at an S&M club.
How could a man make a mistake like that?
Peter Falk was shown a number of potential Columbomobiles available at Universal, but then he spied the Peugeot and fell in love with it as a perfect automotive representation of Columbo. All throughout watching Columbo, I've been trying to work out what the hell this is on the dashboard. I mean, did Columbo use it to dry dishes? Is it a demister, defogger thing?
And that's all I'm going to think about.
Columbo hates guns and rarely uses them, partly because he's seen so much human misery inflicted by them, but mostly because he's incredibly bad with them. He hasn't spent any time on the firing range in years and keeps paying another officer to take his place at the range.
It's $5 for your trouble.
You bribing me, Lieutenant?
I can't hit the target. You gotta give me a break.
Also, when Columbo produces something from a paper bag, it's probably past time you lawyered up. Columbo doesn't have a permanent human sidekick, though at times he has an assistant for the duration of a case, where Columbo will generally treat them as somebody to do all of the boring, runaround work, while Columbo hobnobs with murderers glitterati, just before he finds that missing piece of evidence to send them to prison. Which does sound like Columbo's the sort of guy who ruins a lot of dinner parties.
And that's just the way I like it.
Columbo's 1970s run is a time before forensic investigators were a major part of police investigations. Columbo sometimes picks up evidence with his hands, though he'll mostly use his handkerchief, which has always bothered me. I mean, I often carry a handkerchief, but realistically it doesn't remain sterile very long. As the series evolved, you can see how crime scene protocols evolved, or at least how they were portrayed in television series. In early episodes, a doctor took a quick look at the body and pronounced a probable cause of death, and maybe there was an autopsy later on. If you were lucky, somebody would use a clean, snot-free hanky to pick up a piece of evidence and put it in someone's pocket along with chewing gum, 6 years of cigar ash, and lint.
Yeah, something like that.
There would be photographers and the like, but it would take until the series' return in the 90s for crime scenes to be treated as such. In this 70s run, we'll have scenes of Columbo cracking a hard-boiled egg on a murder weapon. Many episodes of Columbo would also be a deep dive into some industry. Columbo enters as a neophyte and has a crash course in the world of the suspect's business. If an episode revolved around, say, cosmetics, Columbo would start the episode knowing next to nothing about the business, but he was such a quick study that by the end of the episode, he'd know so much that he'd be able to make a fortune posting makeup tutorials on YouTube. Often the knowledge he would gain would be taught to him by the suspect and used to bring down the suspect.
You used a subliminal cut.
Another part of this was technology. Columbo starts off being amazed by cutting-edge technology, or cutting edge for the time, even if most of it is now charmingly obsolete. Things like, what's this called? A telephone answering machine. Now, would you look at that? Or a video cassette recorder. What will they think of next? Or a programmable record player. Son of a gun! or a typewriter that uses a different type of ribbon. Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle, or a robot that types complex computer instructions. What the hell is this?
$3,000? Well, I can get a new car for that, not that I need one.
Columbo was an empathetic character, where he'd often be sympathetic towards the witnesses and the family of the victims, and on several occasions, the killer. That said, he had a habit of turning up at funerals and behaving somewhat inappropriately. I mean, he's not suddenly going to start singing show tunes or juggling bowling balls at a funeral, but doesn't necessarily wait for the end of the service to start asking questions and the like.
Let's examine the possibilities.
Columbo often doesn't appear for at least 15 minutes into an episode, sometimes longer, which is a challenge for viewers wanting to see their hero. But don't worry, once he appears, he will rarely stay off the screen for very long.
Some men, Lieutenant, do not want to look like an unmade bed.
So the elements of Columbo, an unglamorous detective investigating murders of the rich and famous with a beat-up old car and an even older dog, doesn't sound like it's a tailor-made hit, but it would in fact become one of the biggest and most enduring success stories on American television during the 1970s. Of course, it didn't just pop out of thin air.
Wait till I tell my wife.
Richard Levinson and William Lenk were two young writers who both loved mystery stories. They'd find a niche writing for television, but a 1960s writers' strike precluded them from working on movies or series, but not live shows, which were still being made in New York. The pair wrote a one-hour script based on their idea of an inverted mystery, one where the killer's identity and how the murder panned out was already known to the audience, and viewers would watch how the detective pieced it all together. The main character was inspired by the character of Petrovich from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a dogged investigator who would wear the killer down bit by bit. Enough Rope was broadcast as part of the Chevy Mystery Show in 1960 on NBC. Though once the Writers Guild strike ended, Lenk and Levinson felt that they didn't want to return to their old job writing television. Enough Rope had been an interesting exercise, and the pair felt the concept could be easily turned into a stage play, which was in turn quickly snapped up as a touring play, where it was intended that it would eventually end up on Broadway. The stage version, Prescription Murder, was quite successful, but didn't quite make it to New York. Lenk and Levinson had wanted to make running changes, but these were resisted by the producer and the actor playing Columbo, Thomas Mitchell, who did not want to learn new lines. He was actually gravely ill at the time and was replaced by his understudy for the latter part of the play's run. Lenk and Levinson returned to Hollywood as freelance writers on various shows, where they'd write the pilot for a show they'd created, Mannix. Lenk and Levinson joined Universal as contract writers just as a new form of television was taking off. Made-for-TV movies had long been part of television, but by the mid-60s, TV movies had been pulling in excellent ratings and were prized by networks in that they could be promoted as a premiere, rather than just rehashing an already released feature film that had already been out for a few years.
Remember that hypothetical murderer we were talking about?
Made-for-television movies were becoming prestige television. They had longer shooting schedules and better budgets than weekly series, and could attract bigger names at a time when the feature film industry was in the doldrums. Telemovies becoming the place to be, Levinson and Lenk pitched a television movie of Prescription Murder. It seemed like a perfect fit and was eventually to be handled by Richard Irving, a rare example of a studio executive who would take on producing and directing duties for projects that took his fancy. He'd likewise later handle the telemovie that would launch the $6 Million Man in the early 70s.
You're a sly little elf and you should be sitting under your own private little toadstool.
The main character, Lt Columbo, hadn't been written as a specific age, but so far he'd been played by older actors. Early candidates for the role included character actor Lee J. Cobb and Bing Crosby, but it was Peter Falk who'd read the script and really wanted the part.
Who are you?
Lt Columbo, police.
At the age of 3, Peter Falk had had an eye removed after a cancerous tumour was found, and ever since he'd worn a glass eye. Oh, now I feel really bad about all those jokes I'd written about depth perception. Oh, that's just page 1. Oh, page 2. And the bibliography. Falk had had real jobs where, despite his personal disorganisation, he was at one point working a government job as an efficiency expert. Man, he saw them coming. In his late 20s, Peter Falk decided he was going to quit his day job and become a full-time professional New York actor, which he managed to do without first becoming a full-time professional New York taxi driver. Falk's acting career had taken off during the early 60s, where he'd find himself in demand for one-off television roles and supporting roles in features. He'd been nominated for both Emmy Awards and Oscars. Falk was cast as the lead in a weekly series about a lawyer, Trials of O'Brien, which ran for one season in the mid-60s. After this, he was not a fan of working in television and saw his future starring in features, though at the time he was still mainly offered supporting parts. Then he saw the script for Prescription Murder, and that was it.
I don't think I have to remind you that this could be quite the little feather in your cap.
Changes from Levinson and Link's stage play version were minimal. The script would now be much more visual and locations varied. And then Peter Falk added his own touches, such as bringing his own coat, where Columbo here was relatively dapper and only just a little forgetful. A psychiatrist kills his wife, has the help of his mistress to create an alibi, and then a relatively restrained and together Columbo shows up where he hectors the psychiatrist played by Gene Barry and then the mistress. After the girl's apparent suicide, the doctor gloats since he knows Columbo has no proof. Until, of course, he does, thanks to a setup. It's just a pity that Columbo rarely gloats with a line like, "You're basic," or "How do you like them apples?"
I seem to be making a pest of myself.
The movie, though, was a massive rating success. Peter Falk, though, felt he was done with television. NBC and Universal wanted more Columbo, but getting the star to commit to the weekly grind of making a series was going to be tricky.
And then I thought, it's gotta be the money.
Peter Falk did not want to commit to a series where his entire existence would be cranking out series episodes for most of the year. But there was a solution. In the late 1960s, there was the idea of The Wheel, a series that would feature a rotating roster of stars that was refined to a rotating wheel of multiple series of telemovies. NBC's concept was the NBC Mystery Movie, where each week a television movie would feature one of three detectives: McMillan and wife, McCloud, and of course, McColumbo. Sorry, that should read Columbo.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you.
Whereas a weekly one-hour series was something dashed out in 6 days, television movies had longer schedules and bigger budgets, so they could get bigger stars. These TV movies were often designed to run around 75 minutes, which would fill a 90-minute slot with commercials, and they were usually given a 10-day shooting schedule, which in the case of Columbo would turn out to be like someone making a wish just before they blow out candles. Falk was coaxed into making an encore appearance as Columbo in another one-off movie, though this was being treated as a pilot by everyone who wasn't dressed for an English summer.
I know you're going to be very glad to hear this, sir.
In early 1971, Ransom for a Dead Man was screened, a show where, compared to Prescription Murder, Columbo's character was much closer to that of the popular image. The look was there, the scruffiness amped up, and the detective's mannerisms starting to take shape. Again, it was a huge success, and NBC and Universal wanted even more.
Like it?
I'd appreciate it if we didn't talk for a while.
The timing worked out since Peter Falk had financial issues at the time and was ready to talk about working on a series of movies, but he had conditions. Namely, he had to be finished by a certain date for an existing gig on Broadway.
I must say you hardly look the role.
Lincoln Levinson would produce the first season, but the pilot episode, Ransom for a Dead Man, was produced by Dean Hardgrove, who would go on to shepherd some of the best years of Columbo in the 70s. The first season of 6 episodes would be overseen by Columbo's creators, Levinson and Link, and it's during the first season that Falk's friend Everett Chambers worked on a few episodes. With Columbo expected to be a hit series, Peter Falk really started to play up.
This is the world's biggest long shot.
Falk would take his time, learning his script more or less while he was supposed to be shooting scenes. He wanted to find the character and refine the story, which is of course great if you have unlimited time, but it's not great when you're making a television movie with a 10-day schedule.
It's a problem.
That's what I figured.
Peter Falk was a great actor, but quickly acquired a reputation for being, what's the correct medical term? That's right, pain in the ass. They're sitting on a thumbtack, being kicked by somebody wearing cleats, and then there was working with the brilliant Peter Falk on Columbo. According to co-creator William Link, Falk himself shared many of Columbo's characteristics. He was a little sloppy, a little scatterbrained, but as far as work was concerned, his attention to detail bordered on obsessive.
I happen to be in a neighborhood.
Oh, you're always in the neighborhood.
I, on the other hand, am not someone who needs everything to be perfect and have every loose end tied up with a nice, neat B. During the first season of Columbo, Peter Falk would have long discussions and debates and arguments with Lincoln Levinson over minor details in the script. Falk would show a lot of interest in sitting in with film editors. He would walk onto set, and then that's when he really just started learning his lines, going for take after take.
Yes, I'm going to give it all a lot of thought.
The schedule on Columbo shoots would be blown out as each episode took longer and longer to film, mainly down to Falk's way of working.
There is one thing, not that it makes that much difference.
Some other actors would become indignant at the way that Falk would waste their time while shooting episodes of Columbo, even people who were his friends. And then came the words that no television producer at the time wanted to hear: the star wanted to direct.
Probably be a mess, wouldn't it?
Nobody wanted to deal with that, not Lincoln Levinson and certainly not Universal.
It's going to be painful for you.
Falk began his campaign by being late to set and then taking even longer to get ready for scenes, leaving early or feigning illness.
My guess is that he'll say that his client is ill and needs cash.
Falk was suspended by Universal on multiple occasions, but NBC wanted Universal to make the problems go away and just deliver finished Columbo episodes. One director had to finish his episode by using Falk's lighting stand-in to complete shooting. When Falk asked about the stand-in, he was told the stand-in was fired because he wanted to direct. When Falk was ready to return, the director flat out refused to shoot Falk's close-ups and the producer stepped in to finish the episode. A deal for Peter Falk to direct an episode was reached in exchange for adding another episode to the first season. But his schedule would be tight since Falk still had dates on Broadway. The producers had put together a complicated script with a lot of logistical problems. The episode Blueprint for Murder was set on an active construction site. The episode came together, but Falk was content to never again direct an episode of Columbo. He had also had the idea of writing a script for the series, but he would put that ambition aside for several decades before a Peter Falk script was eventually made in the 1990s.
What's your first name?
Lieutenant.
Peter Falk would fuss around so much with the script and Columbo's dialogue that the producers soon realised that the scriptwriters would not need to write too much for Columbo's part. Peter Falk would fill in the details and make it more Columbo-esque, with Columbo's anecdotes, Columbo business, and just general Columboisms.
So that's a good point, sir.
Yes, sir.
A damn good point, and that would explain it. Much obliged.
Peter Falk loved playing Columbo, but he wasn't going to do it for free. So every year, there would be a song and dance between him and the studio where Falk would talk about him not being so sure that he wanted to do more Columbo, where he wanted to pursue movie roles he was being offered, basically anything to prepare Universal and NBC for adding another zero to his checks.
I'm almost positive I can triple your yearly income.
At one point, Falk was offered profit participation, but his reps knew that thanks to studio accounting, that the chances of ever collecting any Columbo profits from the studio was about as likely as Peter Falk enjoying a 3D movie. Later on, when the studio and network tried to rein in the show's costs, they found the show's slow pace of working wasn't down to any malicious games played by Falk, well, not all the time, but down to his desire to make the show the best it could be. And that took time. Plus, he was notoriously indecisive.
I'd sit here forever.
I'm the same. Do I get a large fries, or regular fries and some onion rings? Or do I get a garlic bread, or a garlic pizza, or maybe a focaccia? Spoilers, what often happens is I end up skipping the main meal and just getting all the sides.
Meanwhile, I gotta get back to work.
By the mid-70s, Peter Falk had acquired so much clout that he was A, getting huge pay bumps with each new set of negotiations, B, he was able to get his friends jobs, and C, had become more or less the showrunner in all but name. Eventually, directors hired for the show would be chosen on their ability to be able to work with Falk's method of working, which does sound like a nicer way of saying they were more malleable and less likely to stand up to the star. Columbo shooting schedules would become longer and longer, though in later seasons, the direction will also become a little more standard. Columbo still looked better than most programs on the air, but those nice visual flourishes of earlier years would not appear as often.
What does a thing like that cost?
I don't know. Expensive.
Oh, expensive, sure.
One time, Falk brought in outside writers, including his friend, writer and director Elaine May, and the resulting behind-the-scenes chaos resulted in possibly one of the dullest episodes of the 1970s.
You see?
Columbo episodes were usually designed for a 90-minute slot, but a few stories seemed to need some extra breathing room and were extended to fill a runtime for a 2-hour slot with commercials. Some episodes suit the longer runtime, and some don't. NBC liked the longer runtimes, and gradually there seemed to be more of the longer running episodes out of each season. Some of these episodes can feel heavily padded, like an NFL linebacker moonlighting as a dog trainer. However, some of the longer episodes also feature some quality scenes of Peter Falk Columboing up the place. I mean, often these scenes are strictly unnecessary for the mystery part of the episode, but an episode of Columbo without Peter Falking about just isn't Columbo. It's just Murder, She Wrote with a squint. Normally when sets and locations were noisy, actors would often re-record their lines later on in a dubbing studio. Peter Falk, on the other hand, would often just flat out refuse to do this. So there are several occasions when the dialogue is bafflingly hard to discern, since the production often had to use noisy dialogue recorded on location.
I need to pick up a few things! Is that right, Fred?
By the mid-70s, Falk's relationship with the studio was fraught, but with the show continuing to bring in excellent ratings, Falk would get as long as he wanted to shoot the show and who he wanted to work with.
That must have set you back a few dollars.
At one point, NBC stepped in with a guarantee to cover extra expenses associated with the show's overrunning and the like, but Universal did start to lay down the law and try to trim costs where they could. The maximum amount a show could offer to a guest star was slashed from $20,000 to $12,500, which is why you didn't see quite so many big stars in the mid to late 70s episodes. Columbo had nearly ended after its 5th season, with Last Salute to the Commodore intended as a possible series finale. Peter Falk's film career had finally started to take off, even if he still seemed to be playing a detective most of the time.
I'm an actor, I do impressions. I did the caution show 6 times last year.
Falk himself still enjoyed playing Columbo, almost as much as he enjoyed playing golf, which is why it's unusual that we never got a Columbo where there was a murder on a golf course. And then a change in management at NBC decided, hey, we don't need Columbo that badly, and as such, they were done playing Peter Falk's games. Basically, he could go and Falk himself. Columbo's original run ended in 1978, when NBC decided against renewing the series.
This far, and no farther.
There was a short-lived attempt at a spin-off featuring Mrs. Columbo, except the network wanted somebody younger and sexier than the Mrs. Columbo described by her husband, and so we had Kate Mulgrew playing Kate Columbo in a very brief run of a 1-hour mystery series, which is something we may one day take a look at purely out of morbid curiosity.
My father and I have some very important business to discuss. Daddy's coming home early for a change. No, he isn't.
Peter Falk's portrayal of Columbo had solidified relatively early on in the run, though by the late 70s episodes, there's often a sense of more exaggerated Columboisms, much grander hand gestures, and bigger facial expressions, bordering on mugging. Though if you just brought a dog on set, the joy he expressed always seemed genuine.
Oh, yes, yes, you good dog, yes.
Columbo always seemed short on cash, and seemed quite tight with the money.
And you don't know where I could get a pair that looks like that for around 16 or 17.
My watch cost $30. His must have cost a couple of $100, and it's wrong. It says May 1st.
He seemed to live in a financial state where it was always 1958.
$6.75.
I forgot to add the iced tea.
Columbo seems not to have two sticks to rub together, despite having a small house, old clothes, drives a beaten-up old banger, has no kids.
I think they'll expect a tip, so give them 50 cents.
So what happened there? The answer, possibly, Mrs. Columbo was addicted to no-holds-barred all-night games of bridge, where her massive gambling debts have mounted up to the point where, in servicing the vig to the loan sharks, who as it turns out is also one of Columbo's nephews, the Columbos find it very hard to keep their heads above water, financially speaking.
Yes, I do have certain problems in that area, ma'am, yes.
Columbo had a lot of talent behind the scenes. The show's story editor in early years was Stephen Bochco, who would later create NYPD Blue, Hill Street Blues, and yes, Cop Rock. Larry Cohen, a prolific writer and director for film and television, was also known for a lot of horror films, provided a number of story ideas for Columbo. Stephen J. Cannell, later creator of The Rockford Files and The A-Team, wrote a script on spec during some downtime. One of Steven Spielberg's earliest directing assignments was the first episode of Season 1. Producer Dean Hargrove, who had shepherded some of the best seasons of Columbo, would later co-create series Matlock, Diagnosis Murder, and The Father Dowling Mysteries. Other contributors to the writing and production side included Peter S. Fisher, Everett Chambers, Richard Allen Simmons, who'd also developed Mrs. Columbo. Many of these folks would return for the later run of Columbo episodes in the 90s. Jackson Gillis would write a number of installments, with his stories often having a major twist in the second act, such as another killing or a total subversion of the killer's motives. There are a number of Columbo episodes where Columbo shows up before there's a killing. But since it's Columbo, someone has got to die. Columbo is also unique for something that ran for so long, in that it has no distinctive theme tune. The NBC mystery movie had an overall theme tune, but Columbo would not. Various composers would create Columbo themes for their individual episodes, but none ever became a de facto Columbo theme. In a few episodes, when Falk was vamping during shooting, he'd hum or whistle "This Old Man." Later on, composers would latch onto this and incorporate the tune into the score. By the 1989 episodes, "This Old Man" was everywhere, pretty much like this t-shirt was in 1989. Falk also hired his actor pals in supporting roles, often in different roles. Peter Falk's wife, Shera Denise, would also make multiple appearances in the series. Falk had roped in his good buddy John Cassavetes to play a villain in one episode, though Cassavetes often showed disdain towards television. Another of Falk's pals, actor Ben Gazzara, directed 2 episodes. Peter Falk had formed a friendship with Patrick McGoohan, who would go on to star in several episodes of Columbo, and would also at various times write and direct installments.
We see. I hope so.
Peter Falk's movie career probably hit its zenith alongside the latter years of Columbo's original run, and by the 80s he'd be playing a mix of leading roles in smaller movies and supporting roles, such as his now iconic performance in The Princess Bride. Columbo episodes were still popular as reruns, and around the world, Columbo had been a really popular series in many countries, but only a few of the movies that Falk starred in during the 80s received any attention, and then many people just found it hard to accept him in any other role.
This is a mystery.
By 1989, ABC had wanted to revive the concept of the revolving wheel of TV movie dramas. One of the spokes of that wheel, or at least the one that seemed most appealing to them, would be a revival of Columbo. The ABC mystery movie would eventually run 2 seasons, where Columbo movies would alternate with B.L. Stryker and Gideon Oliver movies, and the following season, B.L. Stryker, Christine Cromwell, and the return of another 70s classic, Kojak. After the mystery movie ended, Columbo movies would be made and screened at more random intervals up until the final movie was broadcast in 2003. Peter Falk was initially hesitant about returning to play Columbo. He agreed with William Link's stipulation that the format remain exactly the same.
It was you who killed him, sir.
Columbo co-creator Richard Levinson had passed away in the 80s. His former partner William Link and former Columbo writer Jackson Gillis put together a number of possible scenarios for murders. When they had enough, Falk agreed to return.
The only thing that's given me any pleasure in this case, Mr. Brady, is charging you with murder.
So, Columbo was back. Columbo looked the same but older, drove the same car but it was older, had the same dog who was happily but somehow miraculously still around. Peter Falk, now in his early 60s, now looked the age you always expected Columbo to be, judging by the slightly old-fashioned way he saw the world.
Just walking along the street.
Heart attack?
No, he got run over by a bakery truck.
The ABC run looks different from the 1970s shows in so many ways. The lighting tends to be a lot more subdued, where there are more dark scenes. It's a lot more atmospheric. And from a simple practical point of view, the sorts of places that Columbo was often set in, offices and mansions, just look different since interior decoration trends had changed so much.
Is that a fact?
That's nothing. Nowadays, in the hospitals, they make them so small, they can stick them right up here.
Thank you very much.
We had fewer of those old-school mansions with drawing rooms and polished wood everywhere, and more modernist interiors with sharp edges and glass tiles. Storylines could also be a little trashier by Columbo standards, where Columbo has long since gotten over his tendency to become embarrassed. There were hints of sex in episodes, and more overt looks at the mental state of characters. And technology had also moved on.
These machines, they baffle me. I think it's what they call a fax machine.
A what?
Fax machine. You know anything about them?
On.
On or off?
Off. On. Off.
Whereas Columbo would often lose his mind at something like a telephone answering machine, now he could be flummoxed by a fax machine.
That device, it's actually called, what is it again?
Ground penetrating radar device, sir.
Amazing instrument.
though he quickly used a custom pager bracelet for one of the series' best gotchas. Forensic techniques were much more advanced. Now we had much more detailed crime scene investigations. By 1989, phone records were a much bigger thing, whereas in the 70s there was little chance of getting a phone log. Killers would have to be that much smarter at avoiding detection, and we would see some doozies. There's a common feeling that the post-1989 episodes are weaker than the series' heyday in the 70s, but on balance I personally don't necessarily agree like that. They started off with the determination that there would be no changes, but these new episodes at the start don't always feel like Columbo.
What the hell are you doing?
That first year was also not a knock it out of the park type success, more of a hit the hot dog vendor in the bleachers. Falk and producers tried to recalibrate for a second season, which was more successful, though the rest of the ABC mystery movies were cancelled after the second season. Columbo would then become a roving movie series on its own, with another 14 telling movies screened at relatively random intervals up until the final Columbo mystery aired in 2003.
When I bought my house, you could buy the whole block for $250,000.
When Columbo returned in 1989, Peter Falk would be credited as a co-executive producer, along with Columbo co-creator William Lake. By the end of the show's run, Peter Falk was in sole charge of the series as executive producer, with various producers and writers reporting directly to the show's star. Peter Falk was obsessed with making the mystery part work, where he would fixate on filling episodes with clever clues, insisting that they pop. For these later episodes, Columbo wouldn't just nod his head and take a puff of his cigar, but he'd show an immense amount of joy at finding a clue. Each new piece of the puzzle wasn't just a piece of the puzzle, but something that required grand gestures, like spiking a football after a touchdown. Columbo would often experiment at crime scenes, timing how long something would take or measuring this, that, and the other, conducting trial runs at the practicalities as he tried to work out how the murder was done. There are many times when Columbo doesn't necessarily have evidence that a crime was committed a certain way, but once he confronts the suspect with a breakdown of how a crime was probably committed, the killers will often just seem to cop to their actions there and then. With Columbo's return, or New Columbo, or Columbo the same generation but later, all episodes were now fixed at running 90 minutes for a 2-hour slot. And now we have Columbo's final confrontation with the killer, often played out at a slower pace. That is, Columbo lays it out all in detail. Some of these confrontations are just two people in a room having a conversation completely devoid of histrionics, and sometimes they're rather theatrical, full of grand flourishes involving props and a cast of characters. And then there are a number of episodes that end in the style of an old-school whodunit, where large groups gather around Columbo to hear him put the case together. And there are even a few episodes where there is no conventional murder. From time to time throughout Columbo's entire run, there would be episodes where Columbo would turn the suspect into its sidekick for the episode. Peter Falk still does what he does best, which is the technical term, piss fart around for a few minutes. And then Columbo finds some joy in something other than nailing a killer, like playing with a dog, or is in awe of people he comes across in his investigations. Peter Falk always just seemed to be having a ball.
Guess where I'm calling from? Wrong. The car.
From the mid to late 90s, Columbos would appear on a sporadic basis, as and when they were completed. Ratings would be up for one movie and down the next. There was always a question over whether there would be more Columbos. By the time of the final installment, Columbo Likes the Nightlife, the ratings were such that future Columbos were unlikely, even though Peter Falk always had plans for more.
Close. But no cigar.
When Columbo began, Falk was making just over $25,000 an episode. By the end of the show's original run, that was up to around $500,000, jumping to $1 million per show when the show returned, and possibly ending at around $2 million a show by the time Columbo ended in 2003. I dig, not to brag, but in my job, we get a sort of bonus. Actually, it's more of a penalty since the pizza is free if we take longer than 30 minutes to deliver it, and that comes out of my pay.
Well, like all those jokes, ma'am, there's good news and bad news. Which do you want first?
Peter Falk passed away in 2011, depriving the world of a great actor, but also of the original Columbo. His ill health and eventual passing exacerbated a schism between his children and his second wife, Sherry Denise, and saddened the world when we realized that the raincoat was going to remain empty.
That cat could be the only witness to this terrible crime. I want that cat.
But there's just one more thing. Columbo was a weird show for me personally, as I was aware of it vaguely, but I'd never paid too much attention to it. As in, I knew of Peter Falk from Columbo, but I don't think anybody in my family ever watched it, despite cop shows and murder mysteries always being on the television at some time. It's possible that it just did not get repeated as often where I lived. It was the idea that Columbo had been embraced by a whole new generation that spurred me into looking more into the series, and I decided to take the plunge and watch Columbo for the very first time. Damn, I have been wasting my time by not watching Columbo before now. It is just brilliant, and by far the most consistently well-made and acted American program of the 1970s. I mean, yes, they generally took a lot longer to make an episode of Columbo than practically anything else. But even when it's a disappointing episode of Columbo, it's still just so damn good. Peter Falk is the show, so on the rare occasions where he's just not feeling perfectly Columbo, or it's just a lesser installment, he still somehow makes the show interesting to watch. Of course, if you just want to see spaceships and fistfights and car chases, and you don't want to attend your child's soccer matches, then Columbo is not the show for you. Though if you've been anti-Columbo or Columbo skeptic or whatever, then I just have to wonder why you've been watching the video up until this point. You may have noticed that we have not zeroed in too much on the litany of huge guest stars or individual episodes, so maybe it's not a bad time to mention that we will be looking at every episode of Columbo in another video.
That the reason I became a cop was to make up for all those jokes I played when I was a kid.
Other shows have taken a heavy dose of inspiration from Columbo, namely Monk and Poker Face, though both shows will veer off into their own thing. You have so many TV sleuths to choose from. Jessica Fletcher or Kojak, or any of the British sleuths, or the miserable Nordic noir detectives. But there's always a good reason for popping on an episode of Columbo, a show that's like wearing a cozy raincoat on a warm day. It shouldn't work, but it just makes you feel better. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
They laughed at Columbo.
Who's Columbo?
The man with the dirty Mac who discovered America.